Hi folks, Howard here. Welcome to Complexity Unraveled. This is the last part of a four-part series on the global state through the lens of US-China competition. The fourth part, New Global Governance, deals with the increasing trend of divergence among nations and the accelerating decay of common ground. If you haven't checked the primer yet, please consider to do so. It will give you a general idea of the topics we cover in this mini-series. First of all, to call the last one New Global Governance is actually quite misleading. We did it just for the sake of aesthetic. It is rather the end of global governance. You see, China joined the WTO in 2001. At that time, China had roughly 20% of the world population. Having the last big nation joining the global economy, it marked a new age of globalization. But here's the thing. Globalization should be more than just interconnected economy and interwoven supply chain. Even though we don't really take ourselves too seriously, here's a rather serious question. What holds us together in the age of globalization? Shouldn't the answer be because we share and believe in the same set of core values? We can have a global community because we all emphasize independence, self-reliance, and uphold the importance of individual interest. We treat each other as equal partners because the ability to think and act in accordance with self-determination is sacred to all of us. Trust can be built among us because we are willing to take responsibility for ourselves, our actions, and our economic and social circumstances. We accept law and order because morally justifiable distribution of rewards and punishment forms the foundation of the society. We argue with facts and figures because we believe that the world has a rational structure. Everything can be explained through logical reasoning and critical inquiry. We can see eye to eye because we're willing to accept views that we disagree and capable of tolerating actions we disapprove. More than 20 years passed by since China joined WTO. Instead of a convergence, what we are seeing can only be described as a complete divergence of fundamental beliefs, moral values, and ethics. The global community, if there was ever one to begin with, is falling apart. Sometimes we can't help but have the impression that the entire world is turning into a madhouse. Here are just a few examples from recent time. And full disclosure, the team behind this channel is largely based in Europe. We genuinely want Europe to have a bright future. But what happened, and is happening in Europe, is nothing less than a total fiasco. European Union is trapped in the identity crisis since day one. The debate over legal supremacy between member states and the European Parliament can be tracked back to 1974. Even though Poland is the one that makes all the headlines right now, the German Constitutional Court has overruled decision from EU as recently as 2020. Any member state can block anything with a single veto, and there is no legal ground to expel any member state. Even though this sounds ridiculous to any person with a common sense, the truth is nobody knows what is European Union. Is European Union a federal state like United States and Germany, or just a confederation like the United Nations? I sincerely hope this doesn't come across as a bad joke. Seriously, we are talking about national sovereignty. Even though nobody has the answer, nobody seems to care. They just call it a design flaw and move on. You are looking at the European Union flag. The 12 stars in the circle symbolize the idea of unity, solidarity, and harmony. It's ironic to say at least, but the rise of autocracy in Hungary and Poland makes people truly wonder whether Europe still shares a common ideology. It would be quite misleading to believe that the deterioration of liberal democracy is an East European problem. Right-wing populism has been gaining ground all over Europe. The election of Boris Johnson is often associated with the rise of populism in Europe. Not to mention that Brexit certainly pushed the Euroscepticism to a new height. Unfortunately, it's not an isolated case. Freedom Party in Austria, AfD from Germany, the League in Italy, Swiss People's Party from Switzerland, New Flemish Alliance in Belgium, The list goes on and on. If anything, at least we can agree on climate change, can't we? I mean, it's without a question humanity's greatest challenge. We need joint effort. Unfortunately, even there, we cannot form a united front. By the way, we also have a video on the topic energy transition. It might surprise you how far away the renewable future actually is. Please consider to watch it if you are interested. Back to the topic at hand. Paris Agreement and its 2-degree target are so detached from basic science, I'm really not sure what justifies its relevance. Just out of desperation or just simple ignorance. It's like jumping out of an airplane without a parachute. I'm still not entirely convinced that ignoring the gravity is the best course of action. According to the latest study from IPCC, based on current trajectory, the global temperature would increase by 3 degrees at the end of this century. The remaining carbon budget will most likely be used up in less than 10 years. To make matters worse, we haven't even seen the carbon peak yet. I'm sure you can still remember the recent climate change conference, COP26 in Glasgow. India and China have caused quite a stir by pushing the rhetoric used on coal from phase out to phase down. It's easy to take the moral high ground and portray these nations as the climate villains. But how about some fact check? Coal is still the single largest source of electricity generation worldwide and provides 37% of global electricity. While increase in energy demand outpacing renewable deployment by such a large margin, developing countries don't seem to have a lot of room for maneuver. And how about nuclear? You probably won't believe this. Nations are still seriously debating whether nuclear could be of some help. Even after the nuclear disaster in Fukushima, the Japanese government made it very clear nuclear power is indispensable for decarbonizing the nation. Worldwide, more than 50 additional nuclear power plants will be built in the next 5 years. And yet, Germany is holding on to its plan of phasing out all its nuclear power plants, even at the cost of losing the control of basic energy supply. Climate change cannot be solved by a single nation. Even at the face of humanity's greatest challenge, nations are not interested in a united front. It doesn't feel right not to talk about COVID. People often say that COVID has divided our society. We beg to differ. The society has long been divided. COVID only makes us see it. In hindsight, we treat this as a bad joke. Do you still remember the beginning of the pandemic? China was locking down major cities. Millions of people were confined in their apartments. In the Western society, we were debating whether people should wear masks. Now, 2 years into the pandemic, China is maintaining the zero COVID policy. It's still locking down cities, at a staggering cost of 2% of their GDP. In Western society, Omicron is being celebrated, considered as the way out of pandemic. We know vaccination doesn't prevent us from getting infected or carrying the virus. But the mantra is really, get vaccinated, get infected, there is a decent chance nothing severe will happen. So good luck on that. No matter what is a person's opinion on this, one could be on either side of the fence. For that person, the other side is just nuts. If just so happened this person is sitting on the fence, the entire world is nuts. We probably can talk about the insanity and craziness all day long. From state-backed mass surveillance to espionage among allies, distrust and hostility have plagued our entire society. And don't even get me started on racism and inequality. I wholeheartedly don't want to turn this video into a rant. But the fact is, we have reached a point that we cannot even agree on whether violence should be condemned under all circumstances. This is way beyond rational society. And here is where I draw the line. I don't want to understand everything. And I'm certainly not capable of doing that. End of story. But I think you get my point. The end of global governance. The divergence of fundamental beliefs and moral values. Just for a change, let's talk about things we do understand. Like in many other cases, technology is once again on the receiving end. At least in the short term. You see, in the age of digitization and connectivity, no one would deny the importance of data. and yet we are seeing completely different attitudes towards data and privacy. Almost every single one of the big techs in the US is under constant legislative scrutiny. Antitrust lawsuits against tech companies are just piling up. It seems American politics finally decided to reel in the big techs. One side of the story is for sure that the tech companies become too big and too powerful. Alphabet, for instance, owns more than 100,000 kilometers of undersea cable that forms the backbone of the internet, which is roughly 9% of all undersea infrastructure. Another side of the story is once again linked back to the competition with China. From corporate executives to government officials, there's really no shortage of people arguing big tech regulation might give China the advantage in the technology race and even put the national security in danger. It's quite evident that somebody has stepped up the lobby effort. I mean, the American society became a neoliberal system in the 80s during the Reagan administration. In essence, the power was passed on from the government to the private sector. Reaganomics was all about deregulation and privatization. It was necessary since US economy was facing a severe stagflation at the time. And it worked. But it also created many problems we know today. The overpowered Silicon Valley and Wall Street are just two examples. Their power over politics is the reason why it's so hard to regulate big techs in a neoliberal system. If anybody wonders why China is cracking down on its own technology sector, the TLDR version is they learned that lesson from the United States. Whether it's too late to reel in the big techs, future will tell. But at least until now, despite of numerous lawsuits and public outcries, big techs do what big techs always do: pay the fine and move on. The EU policymakers celebrate GDPR as a stunning success. They have set the benchmark for data protection. And yet, it's rather rare for us to hear any praise from the industry and business. On the contrary, there is quite a long list of potential negative impacts, especially in terms of hindering competition and penalizing smaller companies. This is actually quite easy to understand. Compared with a less-known small company, we're much more willing to sign off a consent formula if it's from a well-known large company. We have to give credit where credit is due. GDPR definitely does what it's supposed to do. It makes it much more difficult for companies to operate in EU compared with US or China. The recent announcement from Meta, or Facebook, made this point as clear as daylight. It stated in its annual report that due to the changing regulatory environment, it might not be able to further provide its service in Europe. Many people interpret this as empty threat or blackmail. Admittedly, Facebook does not have the best reputation when it comes to user privacy or data protection. Few people believe what Facebook is doing makes the society a better place. But how about this? In an aging society, it goes without saying how important it is to improve the efficiency in the healthcare system, to give people better access to accurate, timely diagnostics and treatment. AI can help. And yet, DeepMind is facing a lawsuit in the UK because of the training data acquired from National Health Service. We are not here to defend anybody. But sometimes I cannot help but think it would be so simple if we could just let technology do what technology does best, making the human society a better place. Let's close the EU chapter on a light note. There was a quite funny comment from Elon Musk. When asked about Blue Origin's lawsuit over the NASA contract, Elon responded, "You cannot sue your way to the moon no matter how good your lawyers are." The European Union appears to be very determined to regulate its way to the technology leadership. By the way, it doesn't stop with data. EU's next target is AI, which would be the very first AI regulation in the world. Well, the government regulation in China. Better not to go down that rabbit hole right here. It's kind of too complicated to cover in just a few minutes, but one thing for sure, for more than 2 decades, the technology sector in China had enjoyed the absolute freedom of operation, the Wild West, so to speak. You know, if we look at the US technology sector, it was a rather smooth transition from the age of internet into the age of mobile. Most big techs were already there in the early days of internet. Everyone carved out its own space and became the absolute behemoths in that area. But Microsoft never had a chance to buy Apple. And Google was never on Amazon's shopping list. They were busy with building their own empires and scaling up their own operations. When they were finally done, they all became too big to become each other's acquisition target. In comparison, the Chinese technology sector leapfrogged into the age of mobile internet. It was simply wild. It happened quite a few times that number one and number two player suddenly merged together and got 90% of market share overnight. It was a totally different game. If you think the US big techs are powerful, you might want to have a deeper look into the Chinese big techs. These companies are playing in their own league. On a side note, we do have a video on the rise of Super App. It might give you some insights into the insane scale of Chinese tech companies. I mean, the recent tech crackdown in China is all about tightening control over the technology sector. The delisting of DD Global on US Stock Exchange made this point perfectly clear. It has never been the question whether data should be collected, but rather who owns it and who can use it. And I think we do need to acknowledge the cultural differences. For Chinese consumers, privacy is not really on the top of their priority list. They have a rather pragmatic view on data collection. As long as it brings convenience and benefits, most people are okay with it. It's probably not such a difficult question to answer who will end up with the richest data set in terms of volume, variety, and velocity. And certainly no one would disagree that quality and availability of dataset would be one of the most crucial, if not the most crucial factor in future AI development. Finally, we have crossed the finish line. This part concludes this 4-part mini-series. Honestly speaking, is the destiny of globalization really the complete disarray of moral values and fundamental beliefs? This is a question we don't want and dare to answer. Only future will tell. I truly appreciate that you have stayed until the very end. If it just so happened this is the very first video you have stumbled upon, we have 3 additional videos to shed some more light from geopolitical, macroeconomic, and industrial perspective. If you want us to have a deeper look into any of the topics mentioned in this video, feel free to drop a comment. Thank you for tuning in and take care.